Hey, let's talk about a story. Okay, the short story we're going to talk about today is The Readers by Ben Lerner, recently in The New Yorker. In The Readers, Ben Lerner explores the parasocial connections that we make through writing and reading in the way that only Ben Lerner can. That is, with extreme neuroses, narcissism, and a commitment to writing as the primary subject of writing. That all may sound like a criticism. It's not. The story brilliantly explores the curious relational structure built by the written word, and somehow Lerner shows us this impossible structure is both a barrier and a path forward. So the story's plot focuses on an unnamed narrator, his interaction with a female therapist while he's going through a health crisis that requires surgery for a life-threatening heart condition. Now, the initial conflict is simply the narrator sort of obsessed with whether the therapist will or will not read his writing. And this passage, that's clearly defined here. Early in my treatment, we decided that you wouldn't read my work, he says. If you had an intense reaction to my writing, of whatever sort, I'd worry it might influence how you related to me. But if you were more or less indifferent to it, I would feel devalued, misunderstood, rejected. Your response, from my perspective, could only be too much or too little. As in most of Lerner's fiction, the narrator is a thinly veiled version of him. In this case, though, Lerner has thinned that veil to the point of non-existence, as the story references many aspects of his life that we know, including the central health episode and the essay he wrote about it. In perhaps the peak metafictional moment, the narrator speculates that his therapist must surely have seen his work in this magazine. The reference to being in the New Yorker feels solidly anchored in reality, yet also highly constructed. After all, a reader can't help but pause and wonder, wait, how did this author or this narrator know that he would get this story published in the New Yorker? Was that line going to be different if the story was published somewhere else? Right? So as a result, the very distinction between fiction and nonfiction kind of collapses as the writing both asserts its reality at the very same time it reminds us that this is all just a meticulously constructed metafiction. Now, this may be the peak moment for this in the story, but this simultaneously demolition of and reminder of the wall between fiction and nonfiction is near constant throughout. And that's all for good reason, as it underscores the narrator's most central concern. So first, he doesn't want the therapist to read his writing because its simultaneous proximity to and distance from his real life could interfere with his therapy. As he says, it would be one thing if I wrote fiction about Cromwell or aliens, but given that my protagonists resemble me, how could I know you weren't mixing us up? Now later, however, he worries that her not reading his writing amounts to some sort of insult or dismissal of his talents and achievements. I thought a psychologist around my age interested in literature living in New York would have read at least one of my novels. I must have had an exaggerated sense of the reach of my literary reputation. It seemed improbable to me that you hadn't at least tried to read some of my prose. I've never read your fiction must mean I find your fiction unreadable. Lerner works these anxieties into a rich lather throughout the first third of the story, and several passages become a comical portrait of authorial neuroses. It's also comically undercut by the fact that he addresses the story directly to her, as I said, referring to her as you throughout, at the same time he's telling her not to read his writing. And also after we discover that he reads her work after discovering that she is also a published author. So he's doing exactly what he asked her not to do. But there's something dead serious about all this as well, because early on the narrator defines one of his central problems as a kind of all or nothing attitude toward connection and relationships. As he says, this structure of feeling, the sense that everything is too much or too little, that the only true options are overwhelming intimacy or abandonment, that you can only merge with a person or be rejected by them, characterized many of my relationships. So every personal relationship for him dangles precariously over the threat of overwhelming intimacy or abandonment. There is no in-between. Writing, however, offers a solution. It is that in-between. It promises that people can connect without ever touching, that they can construct an intimate structure of feeling that exists in some liminal space that isn't just between these extremes, but also somehow beside it, separate but parallel, touching but not touching. And as the story goes on, this version of connection becomes its central subject. When the narrator goes through his health ordeal, he temporarily drops his obsession with the therapist reading or not reading his work. Their sessions instead focus on his intense fears of death, and their relationship ramps up to the point of potential inappropriate frequency and intensity. He sees her multiple times a week and emails her every morning, receiving encouraging responses that help carry him through this period, which he defines as one of emotional collapse. I would extract myself from bed and take my beta blockers and write you a message of despair, and you would write back within an hour. Write something simple and steadying. I hear how hopeless you're feeling, but there is every reason to be hopeful, and I can help carry that hope for you right now, even if you can't access it. I will see you in the office on Tuesday, but call me if you need to speak to me before that. Oddly, though we know the ordeal was real, this seems to be the most fictive aspect of the story. It's hard to believe a therapist would offer this level of care. It seems both unsustainable and potentially unhealthy, but also who knows, right? I mean, perhaps this is exactly what happened. And just like that, once again, we're questioning what is truth and what is fiction here, just in time for us to return to the matter of writing. After the surgery, the writer writes an essay about the experience that, as the story tells us, was published in the New Yorker. Now, in reality, this essay was published in the New York Review of Books, and I can't help but wonder why Lerner made this change. Either publication would work just as well for the story, so the mistruth might seem arbitrary. However, maybe the mistruth is the whole point. It's another reminder of this tension between fact and fiction, right at the moment that the story returns its focus to the power of the written word. Now the narrator becomes fixated on his desire for the therapist to read this essay. In part, he explains, this is because this piece is different from his other work. It is purely documentary, not fiction merged with reality, though he does admit that there are some composite characters. So wait a minute. Why is it different again? Doesn't Lerner do that kind of thing with all his fiction? Never mind the answers to these questions or the true distinctions that might separate Lerner's fiction from nonfiction. The point is, we're again prompted to think about the differences between fiction and nonfiction. We're again thinking about writing as we're reading, which is exactly where Lerner wants us to be, especially when we arrive at the end of the story. But for now, let's just stay with this new conflict. So the narrator wants the therapist to read the essay as a way of thanking her for helping him through this period. He wants to connect with her more intimately than the therapy sessions would allow, but less intimately than a sincere in-person thank you would. His writing is his way of doing that. It is his third or middle option for connection, a method of forging enhanced intimacy that he can control, that is somewhere between or aside from that dichotomy of complete rejection versus uncomfortable merging that he referenced earlier. The therapist, however, refuses, and most of the rest of the story revolves around this disagreement and his resulting confusion. This builds to a moment during which he clumsily tries to force the magazine on her, and she rebuffs it in a pose analogous to defending herself from a physical attack. So let's take a look at that. I opened my mouth to eloquently inform you of my decision, but instead I heard myself mumble something about my progress as I rose from the chair. I had never walked toward you before. The exit was to the right of where I was seated, but now I was suddenly but slowly lurching toward you like some kind of Frankenstein, like Frankenstein O'Hara with his heart in his hand and not in his pocket. This monster whose heart had so recently been arrested and restarted. Something had been set in motion that I was powerless to stop. I wanted to flee the office, but couldn't alter my path. There was nothing to do but close the distance between us and give you my heart piece or bludgeon you with it. But as I finally drew near, you raised both of your hands, palms toward me. I froze. I stopped, as they say, dead in my tracks. The blood pounded in my ears. While your expression remained calm, your face flushed red. You said, "Let's wait and talk about it on Friday. Please hold on to that for now." The way this moment mirrors an assault with references to a monstrous physical attack underscores how it is a breach, an intrusion, an unsolicited forced intimacy on the narrator's part. Reading, we are reminded, exists in this third space. It is an intimacy that cannot be forced on anyone. The story ends with the narrator finally considering the therapist's side of things, applying what he learned when he read her to understand why she might not have wanted to interact so directly with this health issue. Her daughter, he read, experienced a similar health issue, so perhaps the therapist was understandably reluctant to engage with something that hits so close to home and would force her to revisit that more intimately than she wants to. Now, whether the narrator's reading of that is true or not, this gives him a new kind of personal intimacy with the therapist. He feels himself floating ghost-like through her private life. Reading her gives him that sensation of observing and even inappropriately touching aspects of her life, as he describes her husband walking right through him, passing through his body, while he imagines himself floating through her home. So the narrator now firmly exists in this middle relational space that writing and reading create. It is highly intimate yet distant, and this allows him to see her refusal to read his essay as a kindness that, like his heart surgery, stops something to enable it to move forward. This gives him a new reading of that cringe-worthy moment of that palms-up refusal when he tried to force his essay on her. And the cryptic final lines of the story are worth a longer look. I've come to understand your gesture differently, how you stopped me with your palms. Please hold on to that for now. What a beautiful thing to say. You stopped me so that I'd go on. I left it on the train. Somehow her refusal turns into an acceptance and encouragement. Her palms held up were not just a barrier, but also a bridge. They stop him so that he can move on, which he does, abandoning the essay on the subway on his way home. Lerner himself sheds some light on this ending in his interview with the New Yorker on the story. Let's take a look at that. Both the heart surgery and this fiction involve stopping and going on, stopping in order to go on. Literally stopping the heart so that a repair can happen, so it can go on beating, hopefully for a long time. The therapist stops him from approaching her with his essay, dead in his tracks, as he puts it, so that he can go on with his life after his crisis. Lerner's explanation here is helpful in deciphering the exact intention of this ending. However, the correct interpretation of this moment isn't the point. The point is the way the therapist stops him so he can go on, and the way that mirrors the way that writing and reading create a similar kind of relational structure. They are acts that, like the therapist pose here, both refuse connection and allow it to move forward. Accordingly, in the readers, Lerner plumbs the curious depths of the parasocial relationships, intimacy, and strange structure of feeling that writing and reading create. In doing so, he helps us reconsider the power of literature itself. Writing, Lerner shows us in this story, offers a solution to this fear of overwhelming intimacy or abandonment. It forges a compelling way to connect deeply while still also holding the world at arm's length, palms up, erecting both a wall and a bridge.